August 1914, London. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of new rifles. Thousands of young men, boys, really, march toward the railway platforms. But as the British Expeditionary Force prepares to vanish into the mud of France, a different kind of storm breaks at home. The press calls it Khaki Fever. It is a social contagion, a collective pulse where the glamour of the uniform acts like a high-voltage magnet. Young women flock to the military camps by the thousands, drawn by the brass bands and the sudden, terrifying urgency of life during wartime. In the eyes of the public, these girls aren't victims of circumstance. They are a problem to be managed. The Metropolitan Police, an ironclad bastion of whiskers and Victorian rigidity, watches from the sidelines. They are masters of the truncheon and the tavern brawl, but they are paralyzed by this. To the law, a woman is a domestic object, not a public actor. They are equipped to handle a dock strike or a pickpocket, but they are utterly helpless against a demographic shift they never predicted. Imagine the machinery of the state as a massive antique clock. For centuries, the gears have turned in a predictable rhythm. Men work, men fight, men police. Suddenly, the war pulls the mainspring tight. Millions of men are uprooted and dropped into sprawling temporary camps. The social gears begin to grind against one another. Because the police force is an exclusively male priesthood, it possesses a massive blind spot. They cannot enter a women's hostel. They cannot question a young girl without a scandal. They cannot patrol the spaces where women are most at risk. The mechanism of justice is suffering a fatal flaw. Think of the legal system like a plumbing circuit with a one-way valve. The input is a massive influx of vulnerable people into high-risk military zones. But because the law is strictly male, the pressure of social disorder has nowhere to go. The system is designed to punish crime after it happens, not to prevent the quiet exploitation that occurs in the shadows of the barracks. The result is a total breakdown of protection. The law stops at the edge of the girl's doorstep, leaving her to the darkness. A young girl wanders too close to the barracks at night. She is surrounded by soldiers, their laughter sharp as bayonets. A sergeant major watches from the gate. He doesn't see a vulnerability to be shielded. He sees a nuisance. When a concerned passerby points her out, he simply laughs. "The girls will be girls," he says, "and the men, well, they're going to die for king and country. Let them have their fun." It is the prevailing mindset of the era. The system prioritizes the morale of the soldier over the safety of the citizen. They believe the social order will hold because the manual says it must. But the manual was written for a world that died the moment the first telegram of war arrived. While the establishment screams in panic, Margaret Damer Dawson is already in the dark, holding the silence that would save them. She watches the railway stations. She watches the predatory behavior in the flicker of the gaslights. And she realizes that the only way to save these girls is to become the one thing the British Empire refuses to allow: a woman in uniform. Margaret is not a soldier. She is an outsider, a former suffragette who spent the last decade fighting the very men she now intends to help. She knows the weight of a badge, even one that hasn't been granted yet. She understands that in a world of chaos, the only thing more powerful than a gun is a presence that demands respect. She is a woman of iron will, someone who understands that the law is often just a costume worn by those in power. But the police commissioners and the generals see only a meddling woman. They believe their walls are thick enough to keep the social rot at bay. They treat the rising tide of exploitation as a minor budget issue, a footnote in the grand strategy of war. They view the Khaki Fever as a Victorian morality play, not a systemic failure of public safety. The system, at this moment, is a house of cards built on the assumption that women will stay indoors and men will remain disciplined. But war is the great disruptor. The streets of London, Grantham, and Hull are becoming a frontier. The traditional police force is like a man trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. They lack the empathy to de-escalate, the social permission to intervene, and the sheer imagination to see that the world has changed forever. Sir Edward Henry, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, dismisses the idea of female officers with a wave of his hand. He claims that the public would never respect a woman in a blue tunic. He prioritizes tradition over the mounting evidence of child exploitation and social collapse. He believes his department is too established to fail. But the streets respect no tradition. While the commissioner toasts to his perfect system in a private club, a microscopic fracture, the true master of the home front, is beginning to unzip the social order. The silence of the police stations isn't peace, it's an abdication. Every girl who disappears into the shadows of a military train, every young woman coerced in the darkness of a blackout, is a testament to a system that chose pride over protection. The generals and the commissioners have fatally underestimated the opponent. The enemy isn't just the German army across the channel. It is the vacuum of justice they have created in their own backyard. Margaret Damer Dawson knows this. She sees the boss of the situation, the raw, unpoliced reality of a nation in upheaval. She knows that when the system fails, the underdog must build a new one from the scrap. She begins to gather her allies, women who have been arrested, beaten, and ignored by the state, but who possess the one thing the Metropolitan Police lack: the ability to see the invisible victims. They are about to challenge the very definition of authority. They are about to prove that a badge is nothing without the courage to stand where the law fears to tread. But as they prepare to don their homemade tunics and step into the fray, they are not met with gratitude. They are met with mockery. The laughter of the establishment is loud, but it is the nervous laughter of men who realize the ground is shifting beneath their feet. The wind of Khaki Fever is spreading, the camps are growing, and the moral panic is turning into a full-scale crisis. The time for manuals and traditions is over. The hammer is about to fall. Etsiwir, February 1915, Grantham, Lincolnshire. The winter chill doesn't just bite, it lingers, turning the mud of the new military camps into a frozen, jagged wasteland. Here, the system is at its most arrogant. Grantham has been transformed from a quiet market town into a sprawling hive of soldiers. 12,000 men of the 11th Division have descended upon this place, and with them comes the inevitable tide of chaos. The local authorities are overwhelmed. They represent the establishment men who believe that order is maintained through the threat of the cell and the swing of the stick. But you cannot arrest a social shift. You cannot put handcuffs on the desperate hope and terrifying uncertainty that war brings to the young. Into this frozen landscape steps Margaret Damer Dawson and Mary Allen. They arrive not with a government mandate, but with a sense of purpose that the law cannot replicate. They are wearing uniforms they designed themselves, dark blue tunics, felt hats, and a resolve that has been tempered in the fires of the suffrage movement. They are the women's police service. To the local chief constable, they are a joke, a wartime eccentricity. He looks at their lack of official warrants, their lack of weapons, and their lack of a male supervisor, and he sees nothing but a nuisance. You have no power here, the officials tell them. You are civilians in fancy dress. You cannot make an arrest. You cannot even command a civilian to stop. It is the quote of hubris that defines the era. The establishment believes that power comes from a piece of paper signed by a minister. They ignore the reality that true authority is the ability to command respect in the middle of a storm. But Dawson and Allen don't need a warrant to do what the men won't. They begin to patrol the darkened streets around the Belton Park camp. They walk into the shadows where the male officers, hampered by their own rigid protocols, refuse to go. They don't carry truncheons. Instead, they carry notebooks and a quiet, terrifyingly calm presence. The system of the WPS operates on a different logic than the Metropolitan Police. Think of it as a specialized filter. A male officer is like a heavy-duty mesh. He catches the large, violent crimes, but the subtle, human tragedies slip right through. The women are a fine-grained silk. They see the runaway girl at the train station before she is recruited into a brothel. They see the soldier who has had too much to drink and is becoming a danger to himself and others. The mechanism of de-escalation they use is a black box of psychological warfare. While a male officer's arrival usually escalates a situation through a display of force, often leading to a brawl, the WPS officers use the presence. Input: a volatile situation, a group of soldiers harassing a local woman. The mechanic: a female officer steps into the center of the group. Her very existence violates the soldiers' expectations of authority. The sudden cognitive dissonance, the shock of seeing a woman of the law, briefly paralyzes their aggression. Output: the soldiers, confused and suddenly aware of their own behavior, retreat. The threat is neutralized without a single blow being struck. It is a masterpiece of tactical intuition. But the system, hates it. The WPS is constantly undermined. They are denied pay. They are denied the right to use police facilities. They are treated as unofficial ghosts, allowed to exist only because the chaos is too great for the men to handle alone. While the generals in Grantham scoff at these lady policemen, believing that only real soldiers can maintain order, they have fatally underestimated the terrain. The home front isn't a battlefield of geography. It's a battlefield of psychology. By treating the women as a joke, the generals have left a massive gap in their own defenses. It isn't the German army that is threatening the stability of the camp. It's the internal rot of unchecked exploitation. And while the men ignore the rot, the boss in this case, the cold reality of social collapse is preparing to humiliate them. The micro hook of history is always found in the arrogance of the expert. The chief constable of Grantham watches the WPS patrols and predicts they will vanish within a month. He believes the public will laugh them off the streets. but he is ignoring the faces of the mothers in Grantham. He is ignoring the girls who now have someone to turn to when the shadows get too long. The laughter isn't coming from the people. It's coming from the offices. And when the laughter stops, it will be because the experts realized they were the only ones who didn't know how to do their jobs. The tension escalates. The WPS begins to expand, from Grantham to Hull, from London to the munitions factories. These women are now the ghost in the machine. While the government struggles to manage the massive influx of female workers into the factories, women who are suddenly earning their own money and demanding their own agency, the WPS is already there. They are the only ones the factory girls trust. Margaret Damer Dawson understands the eureka moment of her mission. She realizes that her background as a militant suffragette wasn't just a political phase, it was her training. Because she was an outsider, she saw the problem of the streets differently than the experts. While the police saw prostitutes and troublemakers, Dawson saw citizens and victims. She saw patterns of exploitation that the male gaze was literally incapable of registering. She begins to professionalize her force. They train in jujitsu. They study the law better than the men who enforce it. They become so efficient, so undeniably effective, that the establishment is forced into a corner. They cannot admit the women are right, but they cannot afford to let them stop. It is a David versus Goliath struggle played out in the fog of a Lincolnshire winter. The WPS is the David, armed only with the truth of what they see. The Goliath is the British government, draped in medals and protocols, refusing to admit that a group of unofficial women is currently holding the home front together. But the system is a jealous God. It does not like to be shown up. As the WPS grows in popularity and power, the establishment begins to sharpen its knives. They are waiting for a mistake. They are waiting for the moment they can reclaim their monopoly on order. The women are patrolling the edge of a volcano. The war is entering its darkest phase. The Zeppelin raids are beginning. The hunger is setting in. The social fabric is stretched to the breaking point. And in the middle of it all, these women walk the line, knowing that the moment the war ends, the men will try to erase every step they have taken. They are the architects of a new world, building it in the ruins of the old. But the owners of the ruins are watching, and they are not planning to say thank you. November 1918. London. The roar of the crowd is unlike anything the city has ever heard. It is the sound of a world exhaling, a collective release of 4 years of held breath. The armistice has been signed. The Great War is over. In the streets, people dance, they weep, and they embrace strangers in a frenzy of relief. But for Margaret Damer Dawson and the Women's Police Service, the silence that follows the celebration is chilling. During the war, they had become indispensable. When the Zeppelins rained fire on London, it was the women in blue who stayed on the streets, guiding the panicked to shelter while the buildings crumbled. When the munitions factories, those massive, volatile powder kegs, threatened to explode from social unrest, it was the WPS who kept the peace among the canary girls. They had proven through every night patrol and every de-escalated riot that the manual of tradition was a relic. Yet As the ink dries on the peace treaties, the system begins to reset. The establishment, which had tolerated these unofficial protectors out of desperation, now looks at them with a cold, calculating eye. The war was a temporary madness. Now, the natural order must be restored. The hammer falls with a clinical, bureaucratic thud. The order arrives not with a thank you, but with a demand. Disband, return the uniforms, vacate the premises. The Home Office and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Neville Macready, move with a swiftness they never showed during the height of the Khaki Fever. To them, the WPS was never a vanguard of progress. It was a wartime necessity, a tool to be used and then discarded like a rusted shell casing. The climax of this story isn't a battle, it's a betrayal. Imagine the scene. Margaret Damer Dawson stands in her office, surrounded by the records of thousands of girls saved, thousands of crimes prevented. A representative of the state, a man who likely never spent a night in the rain at a military camp, tells her that her service is no longer required. The cruel irony is suffocating. The very skills that made them successful, their empathy, their outsider's perspective, their refusal to use violence, are now cited as the reasons they are unfit for permanent duty. The establishment claims that policing is a male profession because it requires physical force, ignoring the fact that the women had maintained order for 4 years precisely because they didn't rely on it. "You have done your bit," the officials say, their voices dripping with a synthesized gratitude that barely masks their contempt. Now, give the jobs back to the men returning from the front. It is only fair. But history isn't fair. It is written by those who survived the purge. The government attempts to scrub the WPS from the official record. They are told they cannot call themselves police. They are threatened with arrest if they continue to wear the uniforms they bought with their own money. The state tries to turn these pioneers into impersonators. It is a bitter victory. The women won the right to protect their country, only to have their country treat them like criminals the moment the danger passed. Margaret Damer Dawson, whose health had been broken by the relentless pace of her work, died just 2 years after the war ended. She was only 47. She died knowing that the system she helped save was trying to forget her name. We are left with a modern echo that rings through the decades. We look back at 1914 and see the Khaki Fever and the moral panic. And we realize that the establishment's first instinct is always to control the victim rather than the system. We see the same hubris today, the belief that tradition or protocol is more important than human safety. We see the experts dismissing the underdogs until the disaster becomes too loud to ignore. Why did the British Empire ignore the only tactic that could save them? Because the tactic had a woman's face. They chose a broken system over a working solution because the solution challenged their sense of superiority. The Women's Police Service didn't just police the streets. They policed the conscience of a nation. They proved that justice has no gender and that the most effective weapon against chaos isn't a truncheon, but the courage to see the invisible. They were the architects of modern policing, erased by the very men who moved into the house they built. But shadows have a way of lengthening as the sun sets, and in the history of the Great War, the shadow of the woman in the blue tunic is now impossible to ignore. If you believe that stories like Margaret Damer Dawson's deserve to be remembered, join our ranks by subscribing. Your support ensures these voices are never truly silenced. We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.